PhD in Progress series Phase 3, organized by the Global South Network. I'm Dr. Nauman Reayat, lecturer in law, Leicester Law School, the founder and convener of the Global South Network. I'm also the organizer of this series, the PhD in Progress series. It's an absolute honor and privilege to lead this forum for the last more than 1 year. One of the most inclusive, diverse, and equal forum. I'm joined by Dr. Idil Osman, who is a lecturer in media and communication at the Department of Media and Communication, University of Leicester. Her research focuses on how media and communication relate to modern day conflicts, foreign policy, and engage refugee, migrant, and diaspora communities. She holds a PhD in media from the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University and has authored numerous publications that focus on media, conflict, development, and migration, including the most recent book, Media, Diaspora, and Somali Conflict, and Somalis in Europe, Stories from the Somali Diaspora. Prior to her academic transition, she spent over 12 years as a national and international journalist working for the BBC, The Guardian, and The Voice of America in Washington, D.C., covering sub-Saharan Africa and its diaspora. She continues practicing journalism as a writer, commentator, and broadcaster for various outlets, including Al Jazeera, African Arguments, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, CGTN, and TRT World. I'm also joined by Rashidah Abdul Hamid, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law, University of Cambridge. Her PhD project looks at the role of constitutional identity as a basis for limits on constitutional amendments, specifically in the development of the basic structure doctrine in Malaysia. Rashidah is also a managing editor of the Cambridge Law Review and a student fellow at the Faculty of Law, University of Malaysia. Her research interests are in constitutional theory, comparative constitutional law, public law, legal pluralism, and the Malaysian legal system. Before undertaking her doctoral research, Rashidah worked as an in-house legal associate at an investment management firm for over 10 years, specializing in corporate law and corporate due diligence. She obtained her BA Law Trapus from the University of Cambridge in 2012 and the LLM from the University of Malaya in 2021. Last but not the least, our guest speaker for today's session is Mr. Mohammad Golam Sarwar, who is currently pursuing PhD at School of Law, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London as a Commonwealth Scholar. Additional to his extensive research experience, he is also experienced in drafting and reviewing laws and policies, conducting workshops, and coordinating consultations with government and civil society. Mr. Sarwar has previously worked with United Nations Women, UNRCO, UNDP, UNHCR, and National Human Rights Commission. He has experience of drafting state party reports under international human rights treaties for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Bangladesh. He worked as a legal consultant for the University of Oxford under a project on clean river policy in urban Asia. Golam will today present their project titled Making Just Transition Just for Developing Countries, Synergies Between Responsible Investment and Climate Justice. Golam, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes for comment questions of discussant and peer commentator, and 15 minutes of questions and answer session by attendees. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Nauman. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my paper with you. And I'd love to hear feedback, obviously, from the commentators and experts and from the distinguished participants, I would say. So I'll be sharing my presentation. I'm not sure if you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see. It's clear.
Wonderful. So even the settings is fine.
Yes, it's fine.
Wonderful. Yes. So as Dr. Nauman has just said, so I'll be speaking about just transition, which is an emerging issue which is being discussed across the world from different dimensions. But for my presentation, for my paper, basically, I'll be using a couple of lenses. What it basically entails in the context of developing countries. That's my first, approach that I'll be focusing in my paper. And I'll be particularly looking into the synergies between responsible investment and climate justice. As we can imagine that just transition will require a huge financial flow. So and in order to execute and in order to implement that finance, or in order to maintain the consistency of that financial flow, there is a necessity of investment. So what kind of investment basically we are talking about? Because still state parties, international financial institutions are continuously being investing on fossil fuel driven projects, and that is basically leading global crises, including climate crisis and other socioeconomic crises. So briefly, what I will be discussing, why just transition needs to be just. There is obviously just transition is being understood as a fair and equitable process. And at the same time, why it needs to be just also. That's my first proposition. Because just transition will again enable, or just transition will also cause an uneven burden of climate crisis, which is, continuously, which is, currently causing disproportionate burden for the developing economies, for the developing countries, particularly in the global south. And now, and then basically I'll be jumping into the equity and justice dimensions. And the final part of my paper will highlight the linkage and synergies between responsible investment and climate justice. Just to understand, as we have said, that just transition is a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society. And we understand that the existing energy system is extremely dominated by the 82%, as we can see, by the fossil fuel driven projects and energy system. And we cannot probably get out of it in the next 10 to 12 years even. It is expected that if we can, if we still undertake adequate measures to move forward to implement renewable energy projects, still it requires at least 20 years to go for this transition from the existing fossil fuel to renewable and post-carbon, and we set a target of net zero emission by 2050 from the Paris Agreement. So it requires, in terms of time scale, also it requires huge time to execute or to envision this transition that we are talking about. And in order to enable this transition, what we need basically, the first proposition is we need to undertake a fundamental transformation of the global economy. Because as we see the current crises, global crises, including the climate crises and the planetary crises, the core driver of the existing climate crisis is the existing capitalist development model, which influences basically to design the development model and policies, and that lead to ultimately to socio-economic and environmental crises. Obviously, we have seen some developments in terms of development model. We see in 90s the concepts of sustainable development. In 2015, we have seen the formulation of sustainable development goals. But if we see critically the role of sustainable development and particularly the impact of sustainable development in the context of Global South, we see that sustainable development is also causing environmental degradation in the name of development. So we see old stuffs basically in new bottles. Despite the fact that sustainability lenses have been used, but we see the predominant economic growth driver is still there in the global economy, which reflects the global, neoliberal hegemony also. That's what I'm counting as a core driver of climate crisis, and we need to undertake a fundamental transformation. Because why this transformation is important? If we see from the law and policy perspective also, it's not the law which is regulating the existing development model that lead to climate crisis. It's the development that basically shapes the formulation of law and policy. It's the dominant development narrative that basically, influences the, legal and policy framing that plays a facilitative role in terms of causing ecological destruction that we are having. And secondly, what we need, availability of necessary natural resources to undertake just transition. So if we want to enable just transition, we need available natural resources. But we know the facts, and we are aware of this, that we have already breached 7 out of 8 planetary boundaries. So we have already caused huge amount of ecological destruction across the world, and developing countries is suffering the most because of that ecological destruction. So we need natural resources also for enabling just transition. Technological innovation is also needed for just transition. That's indispensable. But at the same time, we need to understand again the lenses of developing countries, the needs and concerns of developing countries, whether we are integrating the needs and concerns of developing countries in terms of innovation technology, right? And technology should be considered as a common good, not as a discourse of intellectual property and not sharing the benefits of this innovation with the developing countries equally and equitably. So this kind of equitable, sharing of technology and innovation is also important for just transition. Effective capital reallocation and effective governance. Obviously, we can imagine the fragility of international global order, or international governance, and democratic erosion and governance erosion, I would say, in the recent past, and we are facing this. So for doing a just transition, effective governance is also important, and capital reallocation. I'll be coming in shortly about capital reallocation and the necessary financial briefs. Lastly, compensating mechanisms to address socio-economic and climate impacts. So since climate is impacting differently to different countries, to different people, so we need to integrate the justice dimension so that developed countries developed countries should pay their respective role of paying compensation to the developing countries. So that kind of mechanism we need to undertake for enabling just transition. So why we are talking about the financial flows and why we are talking about just for developing countries? as I have been saying probably repeatedly, and I'll be emphasizing more probably on this, that developing the existing global inequalities, the existing global crises are impacting developing countries unevenly, disproportionately. So with these current crises, just transition will add more, burden. Just transition will add more inequalities. Just transition will add more uneven impact unless and until we do not understand the inequalities induced or relating to just transition. As you see, the transition, the capital allocation is required for, just transition, for enabling just transition is 9.2 trillion per year, by 2050. And as we have seen also that in COP27 implementation plan, that investment is required for at least 4 to 6 trillion per year to build a low carbon economy. So in order to build a low carbon economy, we need huge financial flow in the form of investment. And you can see the amount. And obviously investment, climate action, just transition is intricately connected with the sustainable development goals that the world is going to, or aiming to at least, to achieve by 2030, at least 2.5 trillion annual investment gap in developing countries. And the reduced carbon emission, at least 6 trillion dollar is required by 2030 to meet less than half of their existing nationally determined contributions. As I have said or indicated earlier, that Paris Agreement has identified the goal of net zero emission, obviously, and reflected the goals of just transition in its preamble, but and indicated the nationally determined contributions by the respective countries. But as we see, what is the amount needed to meet at least less than half of their existing nationally determined contributions? Developing countries need at least 6 trillion by 2030. 100 billion goal is a fraction which was set in 2008 or 9 by the developed countries, or promised by the developed countries, which was not met, unfortunately. And a fraction, about 2 to 3% of this, promise probably has been delivered so far in terms of, delivering 100 billion finance from the developed to the developing countries. And UNCTAD has also identified to achieve the climate and developing or developmental goals in the context of developing countries. At least 2.5 trillion annual financing is required. So as you can see, what gigantic amount of financial assistance or financial need is there to implement or to enable the components which are intricately connected with just transition. And just to add with the the real situation of developing countries, considering the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the current the war, the Ukraine-Russia war and the Palestine war, which is also adding incentives in terms of the fragility of global economy. 60% of the low-income countries are in debt, in distress. So as we can imagine, the vulnerabilities, the precarities of the developing economies, and we can imagine the required financial flows to implement just transition, to implement SDGs, to implement NDCs, and the climate plans. Given that, statistics that we have just seen, to briefly probably why climate justice is required, then why I am talking about the finance, investment, and justice now. Probably I'm jumping into different dimensions, but as you can see, these are interlinked basically, because the causes, the root causes, as I have said, of global crises, the core crises that we are facing today is climate crisis, probably the one of the most important, and the the global inequality we are facing, socio economic crises. The root causes, as you can see, the extractive economic growth and colonialism has also added new incentive to basically to expand the capitalist development model and the growth driven development model to extract natural resources from the global north to the global from the global south to the global north, basically. So colonialism was an enabling tool in terms of facilitating that extraction and to the expansion of capitalist development model in the name of modernity and development. And finally, as I have indicated, as you see, that the footprints of capitalism, the footprints of colonialism, have been embedded into the developmentalism, as I have said, that a capitalist development model, sustainable development, SDGs, obviously sustainable lenses are there, but developmentalism, has been ended up being carrying the legacy of the extractive economic growth and the carrying the legacy of colonialism and cumulatively causing the crises. And that's why we basically, jumping into the, cumulative emissions. Why we need to understand the, the role or the contribution of global north in terms of causing the crises that we are facing, including climate crisis. As you see, the global north is alone responsible in terms of cumulative carbon emission from 1850 to 2050. That's a publication by Lancet. 92% carbon emission has been caused by global north. And as you can see, the USA and EU basically are responsible around 70% of causing carbon emission that lead to the climate and other crises. And as you can imagine, the contribution by the LDC's countries and the emerging economies, 1.1%. But again, there is another dimension here that talking about relieving the burden of developing countries, or do we talking about shifting the responsibility of developing countries also? My proposition is that, as you can see, the developing countries are also contributing currently to the causation of climate crisis by emitting carbon dioxide. As you can see, India and China is leading as the current biggest emitters in terms of emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So what we understand from this fact, obviously these countries have legitimate right to emit, if we can compare with the carbon budget, and if we can compare with the contribution of the global north. Obviously these countries have right to emit, but my proposition is that if we continue this kind of emission to the scale and pace that we are currently doing, that the planetary Earth has not that much affordability. The Earth system cannot afford this kind of climate breakdown caused by this emission of climate crisis. So the responsibility should be borne initially or primarily by the developed countries, but that responsibilities should also be taken by the developing countries also. That's my proposition in terms of taking the responsibility and understanding the synergies between the developing and the developed countries. So what I am proposing in terms of investment, in terms of delivering climate finances, or in terms of delivering financial flows that we have seen few minutes before in my slides. What I am proposing is that the high emitters, whether it is developed, whether it is developing, the high emitters should have duty to reduce emission of greenhouse gases by making deep carbon cuts initially, and they should devote resources to protect people, especially the poor and marginalized sections of the developing economies. And finally, they should they have an obligation, they are under obligation, if we can interpret the responsibility and justice dimension of international environmental law and international emerging climate law also. They have under obligation to compensate the victims of climate crisis in the developing countries. And they also need to provide, fossil fuel subsidies, including compensation for the transition risks. Transferring renewable energy technologies to the developing economies. So overall, what we are proposing, is that we need an international investment related cooperation, and that should, address the wide range of issues that I have just, indicated in this slide. And what is the dilemma, in this regard? Because if we see that still the international agencies, state parties are investing a lot in terms of investing in fossil fuel extractive projects. And those projects have also definitely role in terms of economic development and overall well-being of developing countries. That's undeniable. Obviously, those investment projects are also playing a role to develop the developing countries. But we need to understand that we need to, probably strike a balance between the continuation of climate-friendly fossil fuel extraction and adapting new green and climate-friendly investment. So, there is a dilemma. There remains a clear dilemma in this regard, and how we can make a balance, basically, that between the climate-friendly investment and at the same time climate-unfriendly at the current fossil fuel extractive projects. So we need to understand, probably we need to make a balance between the developmental needs of the developing countries. For example, my country is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is an emerging country which is graduating from LDC to middle income country, right? And it is causing probably, a slight amount, only 0.4% in terms of causing greenhouse gas emission and causing climate change. But it is suffering a lot in terms of climate change. And we are at the risk of losing 17% of our agricultural land by the next 20 years. So climate change is causing a huge burden. So we need to cope with the burden of climate change, and at the same time we have a huge population. They have also developmental needs. So in order to cope with those developmental needs and coping with the climate change impacts, we need huge financial flows also. So this kind of balance is probably required, to achieve the milestone of just transition. Justice dimension, probably I'll be finishing in 2-3 minutes. Nauman, it should be fine. I believe.
Yes, it will be fine.
So justice dimension, that's my last component. As I have said, I have presented the core driver of injustices, I would say. Starting from the capitalist development model to the hegemonic development model, and at the same time global economy, and also the conducive or the facilitative role of global law and policy that leads to extraction and exploitation. So why we need to even reorient justice dimension? Even justice is also, the term justice is also, reflecting hegemony, is also being colonized by the Western discourses, I would say. So we need to reorient also the justice dimension that we are, having in our existing literature. And in terms of justice dimension, to enable just transition, I'm proposing three particular dimensions of justice. One is distributional justice, sharing the burden of inequality and risks associated with the just transition. We need distributional justice and procedural justice. As we see that this transition will affect our labor force, our working force. So we need to probably engage those affected communities. We need to engage with those affected communities in a meaningful way, because we see a deep lack of trust, even with the countries, even with the communities. Those will be, executing just transition, and those will be impacted by just transition. So there is a huge, lack of trust between these enabling and, executing or the victim perspectives. So we need to probably restore trust between these alleged executing agencies and the affected communities, and obviously equity and differential treatment. that's based on corrective justice. I have said or indicated before that developed countries should lead in terms of disbursing their ecological debt because of their uneven or disproportionate contribution of climate crisis. Responsible investment, obviously that again relates how responsible investment can also, foster the climate justice dimensions, or should also be integrated with the climate justice dimension, because just transition connects the environmental and social dimensions of responsible investments. It provides a better understanding. It helps to uncover the investment opportunities, and overall it enables a broad range of strategies considering the local realities in the which are rooted in the local context of the developing countries. And finally, moving ahead, I am proposing about, apart from or in addition to responsible investment, I'm terming it as transformative investment. That why we need to go for transformative investment that will basically connect the climate justice and the just transition roadmap, basically, because transformative investment again links to cumulative responsibility of the developed economies, because it focuses on the supporting interdependent relationship in society across space, time, identities, and species. So, and I'll not be, expanding these dimensions because of the time constraint. And embedded accountability, because why this accountability dimension is important, because the communities, the local realities of the communities in the developing countries are unique. That needs to be reflected in terms of making investment projects that will basically ensure the accountability of the potential investors, either in the form, either by the developed the state level, or in the international financial agency level. Counter hegemony, why this dimension is also important, that relates to transformative investment, because it basically challenges the existing structures of operation, exploitation, and socioeconomic degradation. So transformative investment also uses the justice dimensions, and it identifies the existing limitations of market-based solutions to systematic inequalities, and it leads to deconstructing the unsustainable economy and questioning the thought, science, technology, and institutions that create the cage of the rationality of modernity that we are facing. My last slide, moving ahead, probably how we can enable just transition by enabling the synergies between responsible investment and integrating the justice dimensions that I have proposed here. We need to probably imagine and reimagine the conceptual framing of just transition also, because the existing framing is rooted into the colonial discourse, is rooted into the dominant development narratives that will basically lead, or that will basically add more burden to the developing countries, unless and until we reframe it or reimagine it, considering the needs and concerns or the decolonial agendas of the developing economies. And beyond growth, we should probably focus on beyond growth. Degrowth is there, but there is obviously debate about the degrowth, but we are still talking about beyond growth, since our art system is has or does not have any affordability to accommodate the burden we are putting into our atmosphere. And probably finally, I would say probably we need to coming out of denial about responsibility, about historic responsibility of climate crisis or global crises caused by the Western developing discourse. So we need to coming out probably the denial or collective denial approach from the international communities, from the developed countries. Only then probably we can enable a just transition. Otherwise, it will be, it will be merely a transition probably, or just a transition probably, not just transition. Thank you very much for hearing me. I'll be
Thank
happy
you.
to respond questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Golam, for such a fantastic presentation. I must say it developed my understanding of climate justice, especially the last, the closing remarks, the denial point. I think that is something, it's a bitter pill to swallow for many in the global north, but I will leave that to the question and answer session and the discussant and the peer commentators comment. Before I go to the, before I invite Dr. Idil for her comments, anybody has any questions in attendees? Any comment? All right, now I invite Dr. Idil for her comments. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Nauman. And also thank you to Mohammed. This was a wonderful presentation. For someone who's not a specialist in law or climate change, this has been really enlightening to listen to. And we've heard a lot about the debates of climate change and the sort of the struggle between the need for economic growth for developing countries on one hand, and the sort of responsibility to not contribute to the climate crisis. But what I really liked about your presentation is that you emphasized on the responsibility of the global north, who are also the highest emitters. And so it's a sort of a hypocrisy for them to be behaving like they are the arbiters of the world when it comes to climate justice, but at the same time, they are the highest emitters. What I also really liked is that you didn't just focus on the current context. There is clearly a historical root that is now leading to the climate crisis, and colonialism is at the foundation of that. Extractive mechanisms that have been going on throughout colonialism and the slavery period have also contributed very highly to the crisis that we are witnessing today. So I have a few questions and just some comments. So the emphasis on climate justice and the link to extractive economic growth, I think that needs more awareness. There is at the moment a lot more emphasis on the crisis that's happening. So how are developing countries contributing to that? There's all sorts of country reports that are being done, especially by the sort of multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN. They focus a lot on just looking at what are these specific countries doing in their contribution to climate crisis. And so we've seen a lot of examples from Guyana to your own country, Bangladesh, but there's very little awareness and connections that's being made to the roots of what's led to this, and that's colonialism. So I think a lot more awareness needs to be raised in that area. And then there's also the dilemma that you've mentioned, which is the need to invest in fossil fuel extractions that helps economic growth. But at the same time, this has probably the highest, if not one of the highest impacts on climate crisis. And so I wanted you to elaborate on that, because this is how the so-called developed countries have made their own economic growth. The reason why they are developed is because of investment in fossil fuel extractions. So how can that then be pushed back when growing economies also want to do that? Just 2 weeks ago, I was watching an interview on the BBC that they did with the president of Guyana, where they recently discovered oil and they started, investing in fossil fuel extractions. And I remember the journalist was asking, why do you not feel responsible to not contribute to the climate crisis? So why is your country investing in fossil fuel when you know that we are in a climate crisis? Which I think is a very hypocritical question, because if you look at the way the investments that the UK and the US and the rest of the West have been investing in it, why should we not allow growing economies like Guyana to also invest in fossil fuel, which will allow their economic growth? You've mentioned that a balance needs to be stricken. I was hoping if you could elaborate a bit more on that balance and perhaps give more specific country examples. So you've mentioned Bangladesh. I'm assuming that most national level interests would clash with the international responsibility. So if you could elaborate on that and give some specific country examples if you have those. And then my final question was about the idea of sustainable development. You said that also causes environmental degradation. That was for me eye-opening. I would assume that sustainable development goals would be for climate justice, that the need to grow the economy and at the same time make sure that the climate is looked after. I would assume that the SDGs would balance that equation and they would embed that in it. So the fact that your research is picking up that there is actually a clash and that the SDGs are in fact contributing to environmental degradation, for me is a concern. So do you want to also elaborate on that point? And that's where I will leave it. Thank you very much again for your presentation and for Nauman for inviting me and also for organizing this wonderful network that he's been sustaining for over a year now, I think. So yes, over to you.
Thank you. Well, do you want to respond to Idil's comments and questions now, or you want, let's collect from Rashidah and you want to respond to both together?
I can respond now because quickly and probably overlapping can be also avoided. Yes. And quickly, obviously, because first of all, thank you very much for your, generous comments and very intriguing questions, I would say. And I'm also looking for, the answers of these questions. And just to make an attempt to respond probably about the dilemma, since I have given an example of Bangladesh also, that about the striking balance between the continuation of the existing fossil fuel driven project and the climate friendly investment. Here I again see the role of international community, international financial institutions, and international community, and by that I basically mean the emitters, the high emitters. So obviously, if we ask the developing countries to ensure the sustainable development, to ensure or to consider environment, before development, obviously their pace of their pace of doing economic growth will be halted, and that will lead to economic crises to these countries. So we cannot stop or we cannot ask in that way. But we need to keep in mind that climate crisis is happening and is happening. And causing a lot for the and causing us. A lot for the developing economies, right? So those developing economies will also not be sustainable in the long run if they continue to do fossil fuel driven projects. So here I find the dual role of both developing countries and the developing countries. So in terms of developed countries, they have a specific responsibility or accountability to deliver finance because of their historic emission that they need to deliver. And from the context of the developing countries, they need to start doing they need to start doing reorienting their existing development models to make them more sustainable with the help of finance by the developed countries. And as you can see, and this dimension is clearly rooted in the debate of right to development. So right to development has been diversely interpreted. It had two interpretations. For developing countries, it is the international community who should play the active role, right? And for the developing countries, they're arguing that it's not the developed country, it's the developing countries who should play the role in the domestic countries. So there is a clear position and divergence position in terms of interpreting even right to development, right? And still, there is a huge debate about the right to development. The last point I'd be adding briefly about the sustainable development, why I am saying this narrative, the conceptual framing of sustainable development is extremely problematic, because it again depends on the growth narrative of economic growth. You see, the growth fatigue is embedded into the concept of sustainable development. Obviously, environmental protection lenses is there, but in terms of priority, in terms of dominance, the growth is getting prioritized. The growth indicator is getting prioritized in terms of formulating SDGs. So by keeping that growth intact, by keeping that growth fatigue intact, you cannot probably ensure long-term ecological sustainability that we are talking about. So, and that's the point basically we are talking about. And obviously scholars are arguing that sustainable development is an eco-political project that leads to probably that leads to cause sustainable degradation of environment. So that's how it is being interpreted. Obviously, it has, possible impact, and sustainable development is called an injury therapy model. So it is both healing environment and it is causing destroying environment. So that's the way it is operating. But our art system cannot afford this kind of healing and injury therapy model. That's the way we are interpreting it, and we are talking about reorienting the whole thing. We should prioritize the ecology. We should prioritize the environment before growth. And that's alternative development rooted in indigenous worldviews that we see in Ecuador, Bolivia. UNDP is there. I'm sure you are, aware of this, that ecology is the foundation of development. It's not the economic growth. I'm not sure if I have responded properly to your questions. Over.
Yes, you have, Mohammed. Again, thank you very much. That was very enlightening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammad, for your response. May I first draw your attention towards one of the comments, very useful comments, before we go to Rashidah. And the comment is from Priscilla Katapa, one of the PhD students from Population Health Sciences School. And they are saying, I must say that extractive colonialism is still very much alive today and happening in Africa, especially the extraction of raw materials in Congo, example for electric cars, leading to the pollution of natural environments. The countries where these materials are extracted remain poor and impoverished. It's just a comment. Would you like to respond, agree, disagree? Up to you before I go to Rashidah. You are muted.
Sorry, I can't see the comment here. It's in the chat box, right?
Yeah, it's in the chat box.
All right, I can see now that the extractive colonialism is still very much alive and happening in Africa in the context of raw material in Congo, leading to pollution. The countries where these materials are. Obviously, and that's, I indicated in my presentation that colonialism probably was the enabler of extracting resources, from the global north to the global south, and it is still being continued by the colonizers. And quite interestingly, I need to add one point. It's not only the historic colonizers. They have successfully produced new colonial elites in the context of developing countries, in the context of global south. So global south has now new colonial elites who are now carrying the footprints of the former colonizers. And that's the way colonization is embedded probably into our laws and policies. So it's now being perpetuated in our laws and policies that the footprints of colonialism will be continued probably next 1,000 years. Over.
Thank you. Now I invite our peer commentator Rashidah Abdul Hamid to share her comments and questions if there is any. Over to you, Rashidah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed, for the very interesting presentation. I learned a lot from it. I think it makes a very good case for the incorporation of the lens and the language of justice in addressing the climate crisis. And I think your presentation touched very briefly upon the disproportionate burden of climate crisis on developing countries, and specifically the idea of the ecological debt that the global north owes to the global south. And it seems to me that you are presenting this concept of responsible investment or transformative investment as the most suitable mechanism for the payment of ecological debt. I just want to ask you if you will be addressing in your project the challenges of operating within the framework of international investment law, because I think, you know, as you said yourself, that there is this almost collective denial of responsibility in the global north, and you know how your chosen framework or your chosen mechanism can address that. Yeah.
Thank you. Golam, would like to respond?
I lost the last part probably of your question. Can you please repeat?
Yeah, sure. Because I think there will be challenges, you know, enormous challenges of operating within the framework of international investment law. And I think this is, you know, made worse by what you yourself alluded to the denial of the responsibility of the global north in addressing this concept of ecological debt. So I was wondering if you will be talking about the challenges of operating within international investment law as the preferred mechanism of the payment of ecological debt.
Thank you so much. I see, obviously, international investment law, international environmental law, the other branches of law, obviously reflects, I mean, their formulation and their making is also rooted, I mean, into the Western imagination, Western cultural, legal, and political imagination. That's not the context of the global South. It's mostly reflects or mostly, I mean, serves the interest of the global North, how they basically justify their investment and probably in a very, I mean, lucid languages. As you see the framing of international investment law. Obviously, there are some, I mean, model bilateral investment treaties, which started to include sustainable development provisions. And to add on this, I recently, I mean, worked on a project, how international investment treaties, or to what extent international investment treaties have incorporated the concept of sustainable development. The findings is that obviously some model BITs, which are very few, as you are also aware, that reflect sustainable development in the operative part. Mostly even the concept of sustainable development, which has also even problems, the concept of sustainable development has been reflected mostly in the preambular language of investment treaties, which is not in the operative part. So that reflects basically how sustainability is being ignored in the framing of international investment. And that's the reason I'm proposing of reorienting the international investment laws. I mean, in the light of alternative worldviews, in the light of the existing realities and the local knowledges and beliefs system, which are being embedded in the context of the global South, which are being neglected over the years in the climate negotiations, in the framing of international laws and policies. That's one way. The second thing, probably we need and that's not my purpose even. I mean, just to go for a debate, just to talk about blaming global North only. I see a role of global solidarity also. So and international cooperation also. Obviously, principle of international cooperation is there in international law, but I see more of global solidarity in terms of enabling or in terms of reorienting the existing international investment law, and also to enable, I mean, just transition that we are talking about. So that kind of probably solidarity can create a bridge between the discourses. We obviously indigenous discourses is there in one hand, Western discourses is there one hand, but I see a role of bridge or meaningful bridge, I would say, I mean, with the help of global solidarity between the, I mean, Western and the indigenous, I mean, dimension that will basically add that will basically help us to integrate the alternative dimensions that we are talking about, that the justice dimension that we are talking about, and in order to reorient the law and policy framing, and ultimately what I have said in my presentations also, we need a fundamental transformation of law, economics, and global justice, because I mean these are still problematic in terms of even conceptual framing.
Thank you, Mohammad, for your response. May I draw your attention towards one of the comments, just quickly, if you can respond very briefly to one of the comments in the chat box, and that is from Obert. He's one of the doctoral researcher at the University of Pretoria. So colonial legacies and mineral extractivism seems to perpetuate climate injustice. What should the Global South do to arrest that challenge? Right.
It's a very brilliant question, I would say. Obviously, the problem is there. I mean, as I have said, the colonial legacies and extractivism is still continued, and obviously will be continued. It will be never ending, considering the existing global tension. I mean, in terms of war-driven and other, I mean, inflation, economic inflation, and other crises. So obviously, this legacies will be continued. But what the Global South can do, basically, I see a role of presenting the alternative worldviews in the global forum. We need to probably advocate more in terms of debate, in terms of arguing, in terms of presenting ideas to the international forum to enable, to bring the international community, to bring the global north into the table, that you need to listen to us. We have also our views, you need to listen to us. So that kind of advocacy, that kind of, I mean, alternative, I mean, advocacy tools probably can be one of the ideas. And obviously the research tool is there. We need to do more research in case of, I mean, presenting our alternative worldviews before the international community. Obviously, we can I mean, blame the international community, global north for this, but we need to have also some research, and that should be evidence-based, empirical research, innovation-driven research. And that's the way we basically make our case more stronger to enable, as we see from the current, I mean, protest also in different universities of the USA. So this kind of things probably was unprecedented even, or we couldn't even imagine probably in the last 10 years that the students of USA universities will be protesting to make the USA responsible for expressing solidarity to the commission of war crimes and genocide things. So this kind of things are being, I mean, happening, and I'm hopeful. I mean, this kind of protest, this kind of demonstration, probably advocacy things will be continued to hold the responsible, to hold the perpetrators accountable to the cause.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Golam. I think we are short of time, so I would like to conclude the session by saying that it was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you, Rashidah, to meet you in this session, and to have Dr. Idil as discussant and Golam as presenter. And thank you everybody for your comments and questions. Let's meet same time next week. Our next guest speaker, Gifty A. Brew Mensa, PhD candidate, School of Business, University of Leicester. She's going to deliver her project, Corporate Governance and Financial Soundness, a multi-level case study from Ghana's 2017-18 banking crisis. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Look after yourself.
Thank you so much.
See you next week.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.